Oh hey, we didn't see you there. We're the New Earth Readiness Department, also known as NERD, and we're here to talk to you about climate change in Russia. I'm Kristen.
I'm Zhao Qiang.
I'm Alec.
I'm Emily.
I'm Hui.
We're going to talk to you about the vulnerabilities and opportunities that Russia is faced with in regard to climate change.
And then we're going to go into the histories, trends, and statistics of deforestation and fossil fuel consumption in Russia.
Then we are going to talk about the UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol.
We're going to give voice to the marginalized populations of Russia.
We have a proposal to help Russia to cope the climate change.
So let's get started.
We're going to talk about vulnerabilities and opportunities.
Melting permafrost in Siberia causes landscape changes, and many people may die if unaided, or will migrate to cities looking for homes and work.
For the opportunity, a warmer temperature provide a longer growing season. And melting ice in the Arctic Ocean makes it easier to mining the underwater resources and power generation.
The other vulnerability, higher temperature causes an increased rainfall and also higher risk of flood. Infrastructure universally will be disturbed, endangering human life and creating causes.
And for another opportunity, more accessible Arctic means more sea trade.
A native species population will change, altering food chain. All Russians vulnerable for food insecurity.
Increase availability of natural resources that can be the foundation of a new sustainable development economy.
And likely in forest fire in southern Russia from dry conditions, relocation of Russians to city create economic instability.
Generally, warmer climate reduce energy use in households for individuals and families.
Hi, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about deforestation in Russia. From the 8th to 12th centuries in Russia, forests were used as people pleased. They didn't really have any laws against them or about them. The ancient Slavs were hunters and fishers, and they worshipped the beauty of nature, and they didn't want to cut any trees down. And as Russia developed Christianity, they also vowed to not cut trees down or to put forests in danger. But they needed wood for ships, and they were having a timber shortage, so eventually forests got cut down. 1917 ended the development of Russia as a unitary state, so they began to sell forest land to peasants, and they put taxes on the land, so they started really taking over the forest then. In 1953, the forests kept getting changed around to different managers, and they got unimpairable damage or imperable damage because of that. And then in 1991 is when the Soviet Empire collapsed, and forests went under the power of Federation of Forest, Paper, and Wood Products. So they made a forest code to try and sustain development of the economy, improve the environment, ration forest resources, and preserve ecological communities. But thus far, it hasn't really done much. As far as Russia's carbon footprint goes, 0.85% is due to deforestation, according to indexmundi.com, and that's in 2010. But it's a great decrease from what it was in 1993, which was 4.49%. So still in Russia, most of the emissions come from liquid fuel consumption, which is what Emily can talk to you about.
It's also important to take into consideration the history of the fossil fuel consumption because it impacts the economy Russia's currently in today. So to begin, Russia's excessive consumption of energy is a result from the Soviet Union, having priced energy far below the world market prices. The statistics through Russia's economic history of fossil fuel have had their inflations and depressions. For example, in 1911, their output of their energy declined due to having high demand in energy in a time of general economic contraction. Then, from there, it steadily inclined all the way into the 1990s, having Russia's consumption for energy accounted to outweigh the rest of half of their demands. Today, Russia ranks third in fossil fuel burns behind the U.S. and China.
Taking into account the seriousness of climate change, in 1992 the United Nations convened for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was an attempt to create an international agreement to reduce emissions. The UNFCCC is a philosophical approach to climate change mitigation that focuses on three things. The first being the uncertainty of predictions about what's going to happen. The second being concerns about equity and which countries are responsible for reducing emissions given historical contributions or lack thereof. And third, there's concerns over economy, and any proposal to reduce emissions should not damage world economies. The Kyoto Protocol followed later in 1997, and that was an implementation of the UNFCCC ideas. It used market mechanisms to help countries reduce emissions. Russia's been involved with both the UNFCCC and Kyoto from the beginning, but their involvement has been sporadic and inadequate. In 2001, at COP7, Russia ratified the Kyoto Protocol, which the United States did not. And later at COP16, Russia pledged a 15 to 25% reduction in emissions below their 1990 levels by 2020. However, Kyoto was largely a failure. Russia did not meet those goals, and later they decided to not renew their commitment for the second commitment period. They have contributed to joint implementation projects, however, proposing 98 of them, only of which 2 have passed. In March 2015, Russia promised a 20 to 30% reduction in emissions below 1990 levels by 2030. Given that Russia's economy greatly tanked after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, they've been increasing their emissions since 1990, and they're still not at their 1990 levels, they're below that. So to say that they will reduce their emissions below 1990 levels is actually to say that they will actually have a 30% increase in their emissions above 2012 levels. So Russia's commitment with Kyoto has been inadequate.
The women in Russia generally have low-paying jobs, and they're mostly the only ones that are raising their children. They are negatively affected by the economic changes. And the problem is that the government doesn't exactly recognize them because it's such a male-dominant society. So what we need to focus on is how we are going to make a bigger statement for the sake of women.
I would like to talk a little bit about indigenous peoples. In regard to climate change, indigenous peoples are particularly vulnerable because many of them live subsistence lifestyles, meaning that their food sources are very closely linked to their natural environment. Changing animal and insect populations, droughts, extreme rainfall, and floods all provide risks for food sources and food stability for indigenous people. Examples include the people that live on the coast of the Pacific and the Sea of Okhotsk, who are dependent on marine animals whose migration patterns are changing because of the warming ocean, as well as the Vilyuli people in Siberia who can no longer raise cattle and horses because of increased flooding and rainfall.
There's a large gap between the rich and the poor, and they are 18% below poverty line. The poor cities receive little government support, so they get something, but not a lot. There are towns on flooding rivers, and they have little resources to mitigate or adapt to these floods, which are happening because of climate change and warmer temperatures. And then the warmer temperatures also cause drought-prone south-central areas of Russia to have agriculture like that is very vulnerable to this climate change and could be affected by it. Just some ways that could really help the poor and also these other groups is we could improve infrastructure, we could have drought-resistant crops, and we could do microfinance and social services, but it's definitely something that needs to be looked into more.
So we want to propose a plan to Russia to mitigate climate change and to adapt to the already coming changes. Any plan should stimulate the economy as well as provide a transition from fossil fuels to renewable fuels, and should support all people in the country. This is why we advocate a carbon tax. And in addition to the tax, we want to take the revenue from the tax and divide it equally among all households in Russia. So what we want to do is tax carbon-emitting sources like coal and oil and natural gas as they come out of the ground, and then also at ports of entry to avoid relocation. The companies themselves that are extracting these fossil fuels are going to be paying the price, so citizens won't pay them. The companies will pass the price on to consumers. That will send a market signal to entrepreneurs and to consumers to invest in energy efficiency and research and development for renewable energy sources. The dividend of the fee that's collected by the government will buffer people in Russia against the rising cost of living associated with a carbon tax. We plan to have the tax initially start at $15 per ton and then increase it $10 per ton per year. So a steadily increasing price on carbon sends a signal that something else has to be done, and it provides an incentive for people to develop technology for renewable energy.
We pulled up a record of how much fossil fuel, how many tons were used in the year 2012. So this is for exemplary purposes only, where you're using this number. So according to our proposal, we want to put $15 per ton for the initial year. So going off of this being our initial number, we are multiplying it by 15, which will be the cost for the initial year. Then, for the cost of the initial year, as our proposal says, from then on, we're going to charge $10 per ton. So cost of initial year times 10 equals the cost it'll be for the next year. That's what NY stands for, next year. And then that next year times 10 equals next year subscript 2, meaning the second to next year. And then etc. all the way to 2030, which would be, according to this visual, next year subscript 15 will potentially be 1.3 trillion. So it is really important that NERD comes up with a budget plan for Russia so that we don't go into such great debt.
So there are many social concerns that are coming with this carbon tax that we think Russia should implement. The number one thing is probably the cost that it's going to be to the oil companies that are in Russia. Russia's economy is based a lot on oil, so it's probably going to cause an economic decline in Russia, and it's also going to cost their workers a lot because they're going to get pay cuts, there's going to be a loss of jobs, and the companies are going to have to find different ways to pay for this tax, whether it's for the workers or it's for the people buying the oil. The consumers are going to either have to pay more or find a different way to do different ways of energy. We're hoping that they will do that so we can cut back on oil consumption. And the consumers who have to pay more who are in other countries are probably going to take their business elsewhere, which is also going to cause Russia's economy to decline. But for the sake of the earth and the sake of other countries around us, since we're an Annex 1 country, we have to do what we need to do. And I think the best way to do that is to keep this carbon tax, hopefully encourage other countries to do the same, and, make our economy a little less stable for the time being, just so other economies in other countries can get on their feet.
I'm going to talk about the externality, the climate change and its implication for the life of human beings, society, and environment is one of the most important factors of successful development and effective implementation of climate policy for the benefit of the present and future generations. It's difficult to know true cost of carbon emissions on the environment and the future generation, reduce uncertainty of assessment of future climate change and its consequence for the Russia Federation remains a property of the state-funded climate research. Production may shift to countries with no or lower carbon taxes.
For implications, A well-designed carbon tax is probably the best tool for Russia to fighting climate change and safeguarding the Russia for future generations. Future generations will now suffer from the climate problem and live in a better environment. Russia will create a mature industry based on advanced and environment-friendly technology. And future generations will not rely on oil and gas export. Reform triggered by carbon tax will lead to a more efficient and dynamic economy, and which will help Russia enhance their international competitiveness. Lastly, carbon tax will contribute to spread awareness of climate change among future generations.
So when we're applying the justice theory to our proposal, we first need to recognize what it is. The justice theory implies that not only should fairness be taken into consideration within the home state, but also outside the state as well. So equity not only in the walls of state, but outside. Justice is not only the application of equality, but also the recognition of necessity. This theory applies to our own proposal in aiding Russia by simultaneously helping the ones most vulnerable to the effects of the economy. Mitigation effects will be noted and accounted for these groups by preparing conservation programs and adaptation funds.
So something that needs to be addressed with our new carbon tax and the new plan that we have for Russia are the vulnerable populations there, which include indigenous peoples, women, and the poor. The current populations will probably be a little negatively affected by this, just because we're going to be taxing, their generations. But in the future, things are definitely going to look up for them. Since they're going to be changing means of energy and using less oil, it's going to decrease the intensity of climate change in the future. So we're going to create the Forest Conservation Group, which gives better land to live on and farm on. So that'll do a lot for the indigenous peoples who work with agriculture a lot, and also the women and the poor because they tend to live in the more rural areas. We created a fund for the vulnerable groups, which give advantage for them to get on their feet while they're changing means of energy. This is definitely going to help them, and this adaptation fund is going to be just for them. So we're really trying to concentrate on these groups to help them out. These funds are going to help them to create better infrastructure. They're going to be able to create ecosystems that adapt to the current climate change and will also mitigate future climate change. And it's going to lead their way out of poverty with this fund, and we think it's a great idea.
So that concludes our discussion of climate change in Russia, and in review we'd like to go over our points. The ecosystem changes associated with climate change pose significant risks to infrastructure and the livelihoods of Russian people, but it also offers opportunities in terms of trade and the economy.
It's also important to observe the facts and history of the trends and statistics of deforestation and fossil fuel consumption in Russia, because it created an impact of what the current economy is today.
And we think Russia's involvement in Kyoto Protocol is inadequate, and we think Russia should get more involved in the UNFCCC.
We also gave a voice to marginalized populations in Russia, such as the poor, women, and indigenous peoples, because they need to get their voices heard more often.
Yes, we create this plan.
And so we made the plan that poses a carbon tax on Russian fossil fuels.
And then the plan also includes forest conservation programs, as well as an adaptation fund which will facilitate programs to help vulnerable peoples like indigenous peoples, the poor, and women adapt to the changes that are already coming with climate change.
So again, thank you for watching our discussion, and we are the New Earth Readiness Department, also known as NERD.